think what we'll do is we'll jump into our lesson today. We're in Esther, as we began last week. You're good. We're going to jump in and we're going to try to tackle all of chapter 2. I think it's very possible that we'll do that. There's 3 sections I kind of broke it up into. But before we fully jump into the chapter, I have a question that I really want you to ponder at your tables. But before I release you into that question, I want to just say a prayer, and then you guys can go back and talking. So if you didn't finish what you were talking about, you can finish that up, and then jump into the lesson itself. So let's pray. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for your grace on us as we live in this world, and as we find ourselves in different places at different times. Move us to think about how we may best serve you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, the question that I have for you is discuss at your table at least 3 challenges that come from living in a sinful world and a society that has turned away from God. I'm sure there's plenty. I just limited you to 3.
Right.
Would you like one of these? First question was not good enough. Elaine's out of here. Oh, okay. I'm done with this class. You can talk to yourself.
I will. I did that.
Would you like a succulent to talk to? Like a
I
plant?
thought I probably
There needs to be a function on Kindle where you can do stuff like that.
Well,
Yeah, well, that is, so they take a good writer, and it's not tells the writer, you need some more words in here. And that is going to take over time. Estimates the semester. It is. What else? Let's see.
as it was
majority.
I'm going to say declines.
Yes. They're saying this.
Well, that's morality too.
And the money system.
Yeah. Okay, that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Sinful acts.
That's a big one.
Well, it's not
Well, that's a big one.
Yeah, but it's but
the
Degradation.
right. That's they give large amounts of money for evil things.
That's exactly what happens when we were at this book study that we had read, this book on Pastor Street read.
And you know what I think, and I know it's about it earlier, you know what?
Talking a lot about, but somehow
There were 3, it was a railroad between 3 countries, and I think, you know what? Somebody could come in there and just bomb that out.
years ago.
that she was bestowed these gifts and I said, no. Thank you, it's nice.
All right, we'll come back. What did you guys have? What do you think? As you discussed at your table, what is one challenge that you have living in a sinful world or a society that's turned away from God? Go for it.
It's all about me.
I know it's all about me, but elaborate more. No, elaborate more.
Well, I don't know, you pick up the paper and they have this column of kids all about me. Well, it's not about me, it should be about somebody else.
Yeah, I would say when you look at a society, especially one that's turned away from God, one of the, we'll say, natural inclinations of the sinful heart is to do what?
please yourself.
is to please me. And if there is no, no outside word of God or anything like that, law spoken against that, then it becomes all about me and all about gratifying the things that I want, or me going after the things I want. So that's very good. Anything else? Please.
Well, that's kind of what I thought too, is that people think that they have to put themselves on a pedestal and look at me, and before they can look at other people and how maybe what they're doing is causing harm to other people around them, because they're so important that they need to have them up there on the top.
Sure. Please.
It entices us to change to evil or sinful ways from what we know is we should be doing this, but we're going go along and follow the crowd.
Yeah, excellent. I think that can't be overlooked. Peer pressure is a real thing.
All ages.
What's up?
All ages.
All ages, 100%, right? So if we lived in a society that was constantly encouraging these wonderful and good things, it would be easier to do those things, right? If you live in a society that is constantly encouraging wickedness and evil, then it's a whole lot easier to do what?
Wickedness and
Wickedness and evil, right? And just kind of a side comment to that, enter the church, right? We'd hope that the church is that society that is encouraging those good things, right? In the face then when you go out into the world, where the world, no matter what type of government you have, if it's a worldly government, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be an encouragement to live according to a law-based system, or as you get into ours, everybody just bend to my whim, right? Anybody else? Those are great.
Injustice.
Injustice. How so? I think you're right, but how so?
Well, let's see here. J6ers are in jail and Hunter is pardoned.
And we might say that comes because someone in charge is looking out for who? Himself. Right? And so those who are in this small group, maybe the group that has power, they're the ones that receive benefits. And those who are not then are at the whim of whatever the people in power say they want to happen. And that does happen, like that's happened throughout history, hasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say there's a boomerang to that. Now Hunter cannot plead the fifth and he has to provide testimony.
Sure.
He knows a lot.
Yeah. I won't comment anymore on that. Please.
I think along with what Carol said was that you kind of everybody kind of gets deadened to the sinfulness of these things, just like with homosexuality. It's accepted all over the place and they have to push it on you all the time now.
Yeah, and I'd say it even goes further than that. I would just say sexual promiscuity in general. And I would even say then anger and violence, which if you watch any television show is usually front and center. Any like primetime show.
Well, and the protests that were going on, that all that was violence and destruction and
right.
And
yeah.
it was accepted.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. We're going to come full circle, I think. Hopefully, if we get to the point where I want to get to, which is the conclusion. So, now we're going to jump into Esther chapter 2. We're going to read the first 7 verses, and this is how they read. When King Xerxes was no longer so angry, which actually I think I didn't write any question about that, but that's kind of a commentary on Xerxes in and of himself. When he wasn't so angry, he remembered what Vashti had done and what had been decreed about her. The young men who served as attendants to the king said, "Search for a good-looking young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom to do this. Gather all the good-looking young virgins into the citadel at Susa, to the harem under the supervision of Haggai and the king's unit, the overseer of the women. Give them beauty treatments. The young women who please the king should be queen instead of Vashti." The king agreed and implemented the plan. in the citadel at Susa, there was a Jew named Mordecai, who was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, the Benjaminite. Kish had been taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, with the other captives who were exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah. Mordecai had raised his cousin Hadassah, also called Esther, because she had no father or mother. She was shapely and good-looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his daughter. So that's where we're in. And what I said is, let's comment on, I went too far. Let's comment on the standard of measurement for which the king's advisors suggest that they should find a new replacement for Vashti. So I put comment on the standard of measurement that King Xerxes is using to pick the next queen. What advice might we give? And then there's obviously those passages to look up. There's just 3 of them, but I think they're all very pertinent to this topic. So as we look at it, what's the main thing that we're looking for? It seems like in a queen.
Beauty.
Beauty. Good looking. That's what we want. At least that's what the advisors are saying. Find a good looking gal. Which we might say there's a comment on King Xerxes in and of himself. What were you going to say, Fred?
Virgin.
Yeah. Virgin. Yeah. We're going to talk about this later. I think it's kind of interesting, especially when you read through it in the Hebrew. There's a word for virgin. And in some instances, you might say, we're not for sure if this actually means someone who hasn't had sex yet or a young woman who's ready to be married. But I think as you work through here, I think it's very safe to assume that this is just the qualification. The king is such an egomaniac that he doesn't want any woman that has been defiled. And so there must be a good-looking virgin that he can choose for his next queen. Yes?
Also, I believe the kings for many, many centuries, even up till now, that the reason they want a virgin, just in case they conceive, they want to make sure the child
100%.
belongs to the king.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And that's why you see the people that are in charge of these ladies are eunuchs. They don't want any possibility that something might happen, that heir is produced that wouldn't be a part of the king's line. So I think absolutely 100%. I think when we see this word, virgin makes really good sense. As we look at this, the main point of acceptability or whether or not this is beauty. And what does the Bible tell us about that? Is there anything wrong with beauty?
No.
No, absolutely not. But it's not the only thing, right? You get passages from Proverbs like this. Charm is deceptive and beauty is vapor that vanishes, but a woman who fears the Lord should be praised. So in this regard, as we look at this section from Proverbs, the writer says beauty's not everything. And in fact, even Samuel the prophet learned that lesson when you look at 1 Samuel 16:7. Right, so you go to 1 Samuel 16:7, and you might be able to guess where this takes place from, but as they're getting ready to anoint the next king of Israel besides Saul, Samuel goes to the house of Jesse and he sees his son, and what does he say? Samuel's like, this has got to be the guy. Look at him. And the response is, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at how tall he is, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not look at things the way man does, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Which I think in this regard would be very good advice to give if you're looking for a spouse, whether that be a queen to a king, or even a wife or even a husband. We'd say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? It shouldn't just be about the way the person looks. There's more to someone than that. And also 1 Peter also makes that very clear as well. So 1 Peter 3 and 4 says this. Do not let your beauty be something outward, such as braided hair or wearing gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, let your beauty be the hidden person of your heart, the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in God's sight, right? So, as we think about beauty, the Bible instructs us it's not just an outward thing, but it's more so an inward thing. And you can see from the measurement that King Xerxes is going about this, what does he have in mind? It seems like he could care less about the inside of a woman, the brain and the heart doesn't really matter. Which I think also then is a commentary on him himself. Please.
Well, he probably never would spend that much time with her anyway.
Absolutely.
So he doesn't really care what she's like.
Right, and so
When he's sitting on the throne with his queen for all the public to see, then they go, oh, isn't that wonderful? She's so beautiful.
100%, and it then helps us understand, I think, in we can kind of almost kind of get into his head, which is not very hard to do, but to see like what does he see this lady as?
Something to take advantage of.
An object or an ornament upon his arm. And actually, as we read through, the thing is like you get to kind of watch things unfold, and what you're going to see is, does Esther really have that big of an impact on the Persian Empire?
No.
No, she doesn't.
No.
And that's partly because of this system that we see at work right here. She is in a specific spot in a specific place at this specific time where she is able to kind of rescue the Jews from Haman. But other than that, there isn't really much written. There's no mention of her having any sons that are in the Persian court. There's none of that. So in this regard, what we see is that in this whole process, it seems like beauty is the only thing that matters. And we might talk a little bit more about that as we go down. But any other comments on that?
Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Judy. Yes, it is. Which is kind of interesting. And we're going to see it in the very next section when we jump into it, that there is kind of like this notion that I thought about this myself because, like two guys can look at women differently and say, well, I think this is attractive or I think that is attractive. And so in this regard, how do you know what King Xerxes is going to find attractive? Well, you find the right guy who's taking care of the right things. And that might actually be why Haggai is where he is. That his taste is similar. He understands what the king thinks is attractive. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. But you're right, 100%, Judy. All right, verses 5 and 6 introduce us to Mordecai. And what does the text make us aware of, and what can we say about him? This is I only included this primarily because I think it's kind of interesting, at least for us, to just kind of make sure that we understand who we're working with and who we're talking about. So 5 and 6, we get this introduction. Is that right? 5 and 6. 5 and 6, we get. I was gonna say that's not the right 5 and 6. I got to go back to Esther. I'll just go to Esther. No, I got to go. There it goes. 5 and 6. So what does the text make known to us about Mordecai?
His lineage.
It gives us a little bit of his lineage, absolutely. I think it's really interesting that when we get to talk about Esther, the encouragement is that, and we'll talk about that too, there's an encouragement from Mordecai by Esther not to make known her nationality, her background, and we'll talk about why might that be the case. But, what do you get from Mordecai? It's it's the first thing that you know about this guy. Right? In the citadel of Susa there was a Jew, and then his name was Mordecai. It's not the other way around, which I think is kind of an interesting position of how they wrote this out. Obviously, obviously we need that information because what we're going to see is this is about how the Jews are saved. But I think it's quite interesting that as we get to see Mordecai, the first thing we know about him is that he is a Jew. And then obviously you get all this other stuff. Son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Cush, the Benjaminite. Cush had been taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, with the other captives while in exile, Jeconiah, king of Judah. And these passages that I have on the screen are just that. They're references to these people, these lineages. So the first one, if you go to 1 Samuel 9:1, what you're going to get is a passage that talks about Kish. 1 Samuel, where are we? So it says, here we go. From the tribe of Benjamin there was a man whose name was Kish. He was the son of Abimelech, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Apathiah, a descendant of Benjamin. Kish was a strong warrior and an influential person. He had a son named Saul, who was an impressive young man. Among the men of Israel there was not a better man than Saul. He was the head taller of people. So this is obviously the grandfather of who? The first king of Israel. Or Kish was the father of Saul. So Saul's father, Kish. So Mordecai comes from a royal line, which I think is important for us to note because it kind of helps us understand why and how he makes it into, or why he is in the position he's in. Right? This was not an uncommon thing. We're going to look at another passage that kind of makes it clear. I also think it's kind of interesting that this next passage is, I think, just kind of fascinating. I don't give you the part that I find fascinating about it just because it's not necessarily important to Esther. But if you read it, it says King David came to Bahurim. There he was confronted by a man from the family of the house of Saul. His name was Shimei, son of Gera. He was rushing out calling down curses. Okay, so this individual from Saul's house obviously did not care for David or his men, which I find kind of interesting that now you fast forward and where do you see them? They're in exile. It's just kind of, I think, interesting. But what we see is that here's his lineage. Here's his lineage being mapped out in Samuel. And then you get to 2 King, and you get kind of this, there's an actual deportation that is mentioned in 2 King. And it's not that their names, Mordecai's relatives' names are mentioned, but that it is mentioned of exactly what was talked about in Esther, is that they went into exile with who? Jehoiakim to Babylon, right? And then you get this big long line that other people were also taken, right? He also took the king's mother, the king's wives as eunuchs, and the leading citizens of the land into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And I think this is where I think it's kind of interesting because common of those days, and we know from Daniel, that when a king during that time would conquer a nation, what would they do? They'd take their royal officials, right, and implement them into the government. I think you have that. And I think what's kind of interesting is that after a transition in power from Babylonians into the Persians, you still have some of those Jews in leading positions, which we know to be true from the book of Daniel, don't we? Right? We know to be true from the book of Daniel. Go ahead.
Well, when it says Kish had been taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, does that mean the family of Kish?
Yeah, so in this regard, there is a little bit of like confusion there in the Hebrew because some people will take it that this is just making a reference to Mordecai, almost as if Mordecai was alive when Kish was taken into exile. I don't think that's necessarily the best.
Well, I guess I'm thinking Kish himself was Saul's father, so that he would have not been taken into exile.
Right, which is why I think it makes way more sense to see this as here's Mordecai, and we're talking about the guy who's from this royal line, and his grandfather's or his father, you could say, was taken into exile. Because if you look at this, like this happens, it's not even on the map, but it happens 579, almost 100 years before where we are. And so some people are like, well, could it refer to Mordecai? Was Mordecai taken as like a young boy into exile and then lived through the Babylonian and then into the Persian kingdom? I can't say that it's not, but in my mind it would make way more sense to say that when we look at Mordecai as it comes to Esther, this is just an explanation of his family lineage to help us kind of understand, oh, this is why he is in a court, like a court position. Because he is from a noble line in Jerusalem, right? And he makes it to the point of where, I mean, we're looking at right over here, right? Esther becomes queen, 478. Xerxes is made king, 486. We're going to see 7 years into it, he declares Esther the queen over Vashti. But in this regard, I would say it makes to me good sense to say this is describing his family line. He comes from this family line, and his family line was taken into captivity, and now here he is, 100 years later. There's still Jewish people living in exile, and in this regard, doing what was encouraged, right? Settle down, make this nation your own. Live there because you're going to be there. You're going to be there for a while.
Yeah, they didn't all go back to.
Correct, they didn't. And that's actually kind of interesting as we find ourselves close to Christmas. Some suggest that's why. That's why you get Matthew 2, Magi from the east. Magi from the east. And Esther, I mean, and if you look at this story from Esther, it would only encourage that more. The notion to say there were Jews living in that place at that time, and they had, in this regard, a certain influence in the kingdom, right? Especially as we look at the foundation of this festival of Purim, which we see from Esther, that they did have an influence. And so in this regard, I think, when I think of this, I think of Daniel more than the others, only because Daniel was more, we'll say, I can't say that Daniel was more adamant about his faith than Esther or Mordecai.
More public about it?
So what we see from the scriptures is that he obviously, it's revealed to us that he is public about it, where we don't get that from Esther. But obviously had some kind of influence.
So you wonder where the words were that, I mean, they have, where were the Bible readings or the words that they, I don't know, they didn't call it Bible then, but what kind of history knowledge did they have in the churches or synod? Was it all at Jerusalem, the only place, or?
Yeah, they wouldn't have taken it with them, and what you have is when Ezra goes back, Ezra is responsible, or at least as far as I remember correctly, Ezra's responsible for accumulating all those sources and putting them together in the way that we know it to be today. So in this regard, I would say they probably would have had what they remembered. And maybe people like Daniel or someone in a position like Mordecai might have been able to accumulate or been able to get some kind of scroll of some sort, or maybe the Jews had maybe been able to do that as well. I'd have to do some more looking because I'm not for sure if I recall when reading the exile or taking them into exile if there is scrolls that are taken along. I'm not for sure of that.
But weren't they also big on oral history?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way in which the Hebrew mind thought, you can tell by reading the Hebrew that they would tell the story, and them telling the story is something that would stick into their mind more than it would be for us because we're drastically different with all of our smartphones. I mean, we don't even memorize phone numbers anymore. We don't even memorize basic facts. We'll just be like, what is that? I'll just Google it. And that wasn't the way it was for them. They would tell the stories, and those stories would be passed on by telling those stories. So they probably had a better, I would say that, I don't know. In some instances, they probably were set up more to have a stronger understanding of what had taken place in their history in that sense. Yes?
Well, without going down the rabbit hole, do you think you
That's not possible.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So do you think that you are going to talk a little bit sometime about the Magi? I'm kind of curious now. I mean, I don't want to get off on it, but a little bit more about them as long as we're kind of talking about this era.
In
all honesty, there's not a ton that can be said about the Magi.
They came from the east.
Well, I mean, that's
Yeah.
Were they Jewish people? Were they...
So the word that's used for Magi in the New Testament seems to be very much a carryover of a Persian word. So we kind of place them as being in or underneath this kind of an exile type of situation, to where they were people who at some point had heard about Moses and the Jewish people, which I think is easily said to be from their time in exile. I think that's a fair guess. And I think what you see is that what the Old Testament proclaimed, which was exactly the case, but is also manifested, is that we're going to look at the passage for that though, is that the Israelites were a priest to all nations. The people of Israel itself were the ones who were essentially kind of declaring God's love on this earth. Exodus 19:6 is what we're going to look at, and that's exactly what it says. You'll be a priest to the nations of this world. And then you see this actually manifesting itself in things like the Magi, whom are removed from, we're going to say, the scene that we're looking at, but weren't necessarily removed from the influence of the people when they were in exile. Now I can maybe go back this week and look a little bit more, but I can remember, I think it was last year on Epiphany, I think I preached on the gospel, and you look at this, and the prophecy that's being fulfilled by the Magi coming from the east is from Deuteronomy, and you look at it and you're like, how in the world would anybody have known about this type of a thing? And so I think in this sense, at least for me as I studied that, I would just say the Magi were people who were influenced by the Jews when they were in exile. Or, we're going to even say, which is the same thing as saying influence, they're a carryover, right? It had been maybe more difficult for Mordecai or Esther to go back to Israel. Like, they're not going to do that, right? Because they're serving in this
Capacity.
Right? And so I think what you see is that those who are left behind, what do? They continue to hold out hope. They continue to hold up hope. And then, as they're holding out hope, they see this sign or this star that's in the sky that causes them to say, a Savior has been born. And I think in this sense, if I'm remembering correctly, I would even say, I don't think it's unfair to say that God obviously revealed this to them. Now, I'm not 100% sure exactly how that took place or how that was made known to them. We do see the angel Gabriel doing a lot of stuff at that time with the Virgin Mary and whatnot and all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't move it past the Lord to say, or to cue those people in to say, whether it's through reading of Scripture, where they're reading Deuteronomy, like, oh, there's this star. But the word Magi also is associated with like astronomy and astrology and all that kind of stuff. And so they were people who were looking at the stars very often. And so they recognized this was different than any other star they had seen. I don't know if that satisfies your curiosity or not. Maybe it only makes it worse.
No.
Some things we just absolutely don't know. And I think like the Magi, we're not really given much besides the fact that they're called Magi, and they're from the east. Their history is not told. We don't know how many came. We don't know. Could it have been a group of like 20? It's very possible. All we know is that they had 3 gifts that were mentioned: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But that doesn't mean there was just 3 of them.
Mm-hmm. Or Ham, if you saw the other show.
Oh. You mean Ham is the other Magi? Oh, I see. Okay, they brought Ham. Is that what the other show? I don't know if I would say they brought Ham, but
That was
The best Christmas
The
pageant
best
ever.
Christmas pageant.
I'm not gonna lie, bacon would be an excellent gift. Although I don't think Jesus' family would have partaken of that.
And the older you get, the more you're supposed to learn. Well, last week I was told when you set up your nativity scene, you gotta have the Magi coming in from the east. I had
Yeah.
not heard that before.
You run
Even though
a
I
real
know they
there's
came from
a
the
real
east.
problem though for us in our
When
house
you're-
because our
Goes east,
nativity
north,
scene
and
goes
south.
north-south.
That's what I did last year.
So the Magi are coming in from the north.
I have all my Magi on the
And I'm
list
not,
already.
and we're not moving the sofa table. It's not happening. So,
That's what I'm going,
yeah.
Oh, there's a problem with that.
What's that?
My class.
They didn't come to the stable,
Right.
they came to the house.
Right. I mean, the Magi don't get there Christmas Eve. They don't get there Christmas Day.
Yeah.
They get there about 2 years later. I mean, we know that that's the case because that's the issue or the edict that Herod says, kill every 2-year-old son or under, right? I was joking with Roger one year when he was putting this up. I said, you need to actually put the Magi on the other side of the sidewalk. They need to be farther over because they're not really there. They're not really there. But, I mean, that's obviously traditional, like we Christmas the Magi part. And I think that's because as a church, we recognize Christmas, but as we live in a secular culture, the season of Christmas is not the season of Christmas. The season of Christmas is Advent. Right now, people are like, it's Christmas time. Well, if you're looking at a church, it's Advent. Christmas is the 12 days between December 25th and Epiphany, which is January 6th. That's Christmas. Some people take down their decorations on the day of Christmas. And you like, well, it's now Christmas. Like, yeah, you've had them up since Thanksgiving, but it's actually technically just starting to be Christmas. Like, that kind of doesn't make sense if you're following a church here. But we are influenced by the culture in which we live in. I know some pastors who fought their congregations to not put up Christmas decorations until Christmas. I personally, I don't care.
That was us.
Was it? I
Yeah,
personally don't care.
Absolutely. Ella Fry wanted it right after Thanksgiving, and Pastor Nauman used to argue with that, and
I
we would
don't.
wait.
I don't
Because she
care.
wanted it.
I don't care. I think in this regard, they're decorations.
Yeah.
Decorations.
Absolutely.
Well, and I read yesterday that some have the tradition that the Epiphany season goes until Ash Wednesday. So this
It does.
year, Ash Wednesday is March 5th, so I get to keep the Christmas decorations up until March 4th.
If you want to, that's fine. It's totally fine with me. I would say in this regard, though, the season of Epiphany does shift the mindset, or should change the shift the mindset of the people in the church. It's no longer about, oh, Jesus is born. It's, who is this Jesus? Because that's what Epiphany is. It's the revealing of who Jesus is. And actually, as we move forward, I think I'm going to try to encourage people to think more in line with the church calendar than the secular calendar. Just because I think it's good for us to have that kind of in our back of our mind. So like for New Year's Eve, this might not make people very happy, but I think I'm going to preach on the circumcision of Jesus, because that's really what took place on that day. And that has actually been the historical reading for the church. We met as a study club, and Lloyd says, I've never preached on this. I think I'm going to. I said, Lloyd, I'll do it with you. So you come New Year's Eve, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be that. And I think next year, our New Year's service, I'm actually going to move to Christ the King Sunday, which is the last Sunday of the church year. Because I think it's good for us to... Where else are you going to focus on the church year except
In church.
in church?
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, all other places you're going to have the influence of all this other stuff. So, it's coming, I guess. If that makes you happy or not, I'm sorry, or I'm not sorry, I guess.
That
I don't know.
Sunday saying
Yeah.
Happy New Year.
What can we say about Mordecai? Well, in verse 7, it talks about him caring for her, adopted her as his daughter when her parents died.
Yeah.
Does that make him a kinsman redeemer? Or like a kinsman redeemer?
Isn't that more
You know, I don't
fair?
necessarily know. My mindset had never actually went to that kind of a place.
That's more brother-in-law.
Well, I mean,
Sister-in-law, isn't it?
in this regard, it's a relative who is close to you who would take care of you. I think in this sense, I think what you can say is, I don't know if I'd call him a kinsman redeemer, although I don't know if I would say you're wrong to say he is that. I would just say, I think, at least when I look at this, what you see is someone who cares about those who are related to him. Which I actually have a spot later on where it says, you should note this, that Mordecai actually does care about Esther. So much so that when we get to verse 11, which we haven't gotten to yet, he's going and talking to her on a regular basis every day to make sure she's doing all right, to see how things are going. And I don't think from the text you can say he's just fishing to see how he can better advance himself. It seems very clear to me that Mordecai actually cares about Esther. That this is someone who is looking after her well-being, who's desperately trying to make sure that she's doing the things that keep her safe.
Doesn't want her to get killed off.
Right, and we'll talk about that as we move forward too. All right,
I think you should have hid her.
What?
I mean, if you really cared, you should have maybe hid her.
Yeah, I wonder though if that wasn't an option. Like, I wonder if that's not really a real viable option. Like, it might be that people in the court already knew about her, and then this decree came around.
Right.
Although they wouldn't have known everything about her because Esther didn't tell anybody about her background. Right. So there's a lot of unknowns. As we read through this, there's a lot of unknowns. And you might find yourself going one chapter being like, that sounds kind of strange. And the other chapter's like, oh, this seems evidence for, like, yeah, this seems good. But so that's all I can say. I'm sorry, there's not much to be said. I think it's kind of interesting, though, that when we do meet the two main characters of the story, which is Esther and Mordecai, I think you can obviously say Haman's a main character. I think you can say King Xerxes is too. That what we can say about their names, I think, is kind of interesting. Mordecai seems to have come from man of Marduk. One of Marduk. Marduk is a god, a heathen god. Esther is a word for star, probably derived from Ishtar, goddess. So you've got these two Jews who have these new names, and their names are wrapped up into false deities. But that's not uncommon. You read Daniel, right? Daniel chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. What do you see? That these Jewish men who were taken into captivity, they all get new names. And the names by which we know them are not their Jewish names. Well, Daniel we still know by his Jewish name, but the other ones, it's their Babylonian names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are all Babylonian names. Daniel's Babylonian name is like Belshazzar.
It's because they couldn't spell.
Yeah, well, it's hard. It's so hard.
It's a nickname.
It's a nickname. But that's not uncommon. Not uncommon. All right, let's jump into 8 through 18. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, and many young women had been gathered into the citadel of Susa under the supervision of Haggai, Esther was taken to the king's palace. To Haggai, who was in charge of the harem, she pleased Haggai and gained his favor. He quickly provided her with beauty treatments and food. He assigned a good position in the harem to her, and to the 7 female attendants picked out for her from the king's palace. Esther had not revealed her nationality or her family background because Mordecai had told her not to do so. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the harem to learn about Esther's well-being and about what was going to be done with her. Every young woman received a turn to go to King Xerxes after she had received the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments. For 6 months they used oil, myrrh, and for 6 months perfume and other beauty treatments for women. Then the young women went to the king. Everything she desired was given to her when she went from the harem to the king's palace. She went to the king in the evening, and in the morning she returned to the second harem. Under the supervision of Shazazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not return to the king unless he was delighted with her, and she was summoned by name. Esther was the daughter of Abihal, Mordecai's uncle. Mordecai had adopted her. And when her turn came to go to the king, she did not ask for anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, had advised. Esther won the approval of everyone watching her. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, during the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than he loved all the other women. She won his favor and approval more than all the other virgins did. He placed the crown of the kingdom on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great banquet in honor of Esther for all his officials and ministers. He declared a tax holiday for the province, and he gave gifts as only the king could give. So there you have this process in which all this takes place. How did the Lord begin to elevate Esther to her position as queen? Right from the very beginning, when she enters into this thing, what takes place? She finds favor not with the king, but first
The eunuch.
the
In
eunuch.
charge.
Yeah. Haggai sees her. He is in some way influenced by her. He finds favor in her, or she finds favor in his eyes. And so then he immediately puts her into a position to where she can be successful in this aspect. And as Esther goes about trying to be in the position of queen, she listens to him. That's kind of an interesting thing. It's just kind of interesting. I don't know if I want to say anything more, though, because I got some other stuff I want to get to. We already talked about 6. Mordecai does care for Esther. I think that's very clear. And then I said take a moment and comment on the morality and wisdom of this procedure.
It's just strange what they used to do to try to please the king.
Yeah, the passage that I got there is Hebrews 13:4, which is the marriage bed should be honored by all. Right? And what do we see here?
It's praying before everybody.
Kind of not. Not anywhere close to that. In fact, there are probably many other passages that we could point to in the Bible that would say this just doesn't seem right. Because it's pretty, it seems to be very clear that what happens when a young woman goes to the king is that there's intimacy there. And then if she is not pleasing to him, she gets taken to a harem, or she gets put into the concubines, where she's essentially a widow now, to live. It is kind of amazing. Does anybody have any other passages? I thought I'd leave this one open to you. Any other passages that we look at and say, this just seems to go against everything that Scripture says about the way we should honor and cherish the blessing that is marriage? Anybody think of a passage?
No, but I have a comment. We
Please.
had King David, King Solomon, all these people did
Yeah.
that, and they were children of God, and they knew better, but they did it anyway because of the power that they had.
Yeah, absolutely. David took on more than one wife. Absolutely he did. So did Solomon. In fact, Solomon, you have that glaring passage towards the end of, I think it's in 2 Samuel, where it's like how many women he had. 300 wives, 600 concubines, or something like that. It's like, wow.
Why?
Yeah. I can't comment on why. I could try to put the best construction on it and say some of those maybe for political reasons. You take the daughter of a king to kind of create some kind of alliance.
Bond or something.
But still, in that regard, it's really a grasping at straws because this is not what God has said, right? And I think the passages that I would look to is back in Genesis, right? Genesis 2:24, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Not wives, but wife.
Well, and their kingdoms fell apart.
Yeah, they did.
But God uses sinful men when you think of Abraham
I know.
and Jacob.
Yeah.
It's not
Well,
the
every-
king, but yet because sometimes people say, well, how can you have all that sinfulness in the Bible and that, but that's how
That's
he
what it is.
makes it all work. Yeah.
Yeah.
All things work together for good when you think of him in charge. But
Yeah. Elaine.
Well, I'm just always amazed that they spend a year preparing these young women to meet the king.
Yeah.
So maybe.
And
they're
it all
teenagers
comes to one.
Yeah.
One
they're
night.
teenagers and they have pimples and they have to get rid of them or something. I don't know.
You have no idea. I don't know.
It's like a whole year.
I don't know. I'm not going to say anything.
Maybe he
I
likes
will-
his women chubby and they
I-
had to eat.
I don't know. I'm going to refrain. I can't. No, I'm going to say it. I just don't know how much does a year of beauty treatment really do. I would think maybe, half a year at the most. But by the time you hit half a year, you're probably going to be as pretty as you're going to be. I could be wrong.
And they did have makeup and stuff then too that they could.
Absolutely.
Put
Yeah.
on in, 2 hours, they could get them.
Well, I wonder if to some of this is not just, like someone apply, like, but maybe instructing and training.
Yeah.
If you do get to the point where he is satisfied with you, then you are in such a position to where you can just live as queen. You know how to go through all the rigmarole and all that kind
You
of
have to
stuff.
know how to speak.
Yeah, and all that. Yeah.
properly
So you
address
think of
them.
like what is that? The Princess Diaries from Disney, where she's being trained as a
Well, and what
a
other-
princess or
what other
whatever.
movie
Yeah.
is that?
Walk with. They probably walked with scrolls on their heads instead
They,
of books. Yeah.
the English do that yet.
Yeah.
Princess Kate.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
through all this training, and
Yeah.
Megan failed, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
They do this for these
Yeah.
young ladies.
Yeah.
And the men. The
Yeah.
men have to know all
And
this.
maybe that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's.
Debs, did you have something?
It was covered.
Cool. All right. I have that in here because that very last comment places us right here. Right 479, the 7th year of his reign. So this expanding this out probably was expanded out. I think partly because of the battles and stuff that Xerxes was working on, right? So Xerxes is going off to battle as all this is taking place, and he defeats the Greeks, but is later defeated at Salamis. And I think part of that is that he comes back, and I think then there's that. That might actually be the very beginning of chapter 2, where he comes back and he's like, all right, I want to replace Vashti. And then you get this whole rigmarole thing. So I don't know. But it's very possible that might be the case. Can't say for certain, but it's very possible. We are going to get through this chapter. That's great news. All right, here we go. When the virgins were gathered together for a second time, which the EHV provides, I think, a helpful note, or moved to a second harm, I think that makes good sense. I just think that makes good sense. So when there's a change or a switch that's taking place in the ladies of the court, which would have probably been a big switch and change, like a lot of moving parts and things, which helps us kind of set the mindset for what's going to happen next. Mordecai was sitting in the gatehouse to the king's palace. Esther had not revealed her family or her nationality because when Mordecai had been taking care of her, Mordecai had told her not to do so. And when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gatehouse, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who controlled access to the entrance to the palace, became very angry and plotted to kill King Xerxes. When Mordecai learned about this, he told Queen Esther. She passed the report along to the king, crediting Mordecai by name. The matter was investigated and the charges were found to be true, and both of those men were hanged. This instance was recorded in the daily record book in the presence of the king. So, we've got this kind of amazing thing being unfolded. So these verses actually set the stage for this story of Esther. Right? We're working up to it. Esther's now finally queen. But there's also this other thing that's taken place, which is a plot to kill King Xerxes, which has been revealed. And what happens, I kind of think it's amazing, but what does this chapter then teach us about the way in which God works? As you look at all these things unfolding, what does this teach us about the way in which God works?
He picks the time when it's gonna happen.
For the good of those who love him.
Yeah, like he is ultimately in control, and he is working behind the scenes, right? Because if this doesn't happen, guess what? The whole book of Esther just crumbles apart. If Mordecai doesn't overhear or uncover this plot, then King Xerxes doesn't owe him a favor at all, which means that Haman gets to happen what exactly he's going to plan to happen, which we'll read more about as we move forward. That is truly, as you look at things unfold, you can rightfully see the Lord's hand in all of this. It is definitely working behind the scenes. Definitely working behind the scenes. And this, I think, is probably one of the bigger questions that I think is important for us to look at, is putting the best construction on the situation. What can we make of Mordecai's advice to Esther that she should hide her background and nationality? Why might Mordecai say that to Esther? And what can we say about it? And the passages that I have listed there are Exodus 19:6, which is that passage I had spoken to you about earlier. Maybe what we'll do is we'll just look them up and talk about it with everybody. So Exodus 19:6. You will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. So this is the words that the Lord speaks to the elders of the Israelites when they're all meeting together up on the top of Mount Sinai. They're getting ready to receive the law of God. And this is what is said to them. You're going to be my kingdom of priests. Meaning not just the Levites are being priests, but all the people are priests. So in this sense, and you see that thought carried over in the New Testament in the book of 1 Peter, right? Where he says, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. The people of Israel were supposed to be that to all the other nations around. In fact, when people would come across the Jewish nation, they should, in this regard, recognize them as different. Right? Because they were the people of the one true God. And that is absolutely made clear right from the very beginning in Exodus 9. And then when you get to the New Testament, Jesus, he seems to make the same kind of point as he does ministry, this Matthew passage from Matthew 5. And the verses that are around it also support it, but you probably know it, right? In the same way, let your light shine in the people's presence, so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And then you've got the passage from John 13:35. Similar. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another, which is, I put that in there specifically for a purpose, right? And then the last passage from John chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4, verse 12. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God remains in us, and his love has been brought to its goal in us. I think this is an important passage, especially as we talk about Esther and Mordecai. What can we say about the background, or having them conceal their background? If we are going to follow the 8th commandment on this, what might we say?
You need to be told at the right time.
Okay?
So is this considered a little white lie, withholding information?
So in this regard, we're going to say it actually could be sinful. Let's not move past this, right? Mordecai actually could, in some regard, in his sinful way, have said, this is not good for us. We're kind of embarrassed by this, and it would be not of an advantage to be labeled as one of God's holy people. And so he might have, with disdain, told Esther, don't tell anybody about this. It's only going to turn out bad for you. So it's very possible that in his heart he could have been sinning as he was instructing Esther, and she could have been sinning as she did not do this either. But we're putting the best construction on this, and so we're going to say, for some reason, we're not for certain why, it seemed advantageous to hide their Jewishness so that they could continue to live and maybe do more ministry work.
I think of Moses and whenever he and his wife, they were in this land, and he said, don't tell him you're my sister or whatever, And
Abraham.
Abraham, not Moses. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing that we don't have here is it's just silence on the issue, isn't there? Right? There's no this is good, this is bad. It's just silence. It's just made known that this is something that they did, but there's no scripture telling us this was right or wrong. And so in this sense, we can't actually speak too harshly against it or encourage it either, can we? I think with Abraham, you get the notion of saying that was a bad thing because he is chastised by that Egyptian Pharaoh saying, you tricked me. right? You'd given me your wife, placed off as your sister, and then because that took place, bad things started to happen to me, and shame on you, kind of. And so in this sense, Abraham, we see in Scripture kind of bears this out, this was a bad thing.
But
How-
when Moses was hid and the Pharaoh's daughter finds him, the little sister, or the big sister didn't say, oh, by the way, that's my brother. I mean, she just went to
Right,
her mom to nurse
right.
the child.
Right.
And it was a way to preserve things.
Right, and I think in this sense too, obviously Moses grew up understanding his heritage.
Yeah.
There is no question about that. Like, you can't remove yourself from that. In fact, I think as I studied, last time I walked through Exodus and was studying it, I kind of think that Moses had a stronger understanding of his Hebrewness than most think. I think he thought that maybe he was actually going to be the one who was going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt.
Well, he tried it.
Well, that's why I think you have that notion of him killing that Egyptian. I think Moses thought, like, I'm the one. I'm in this place. He might have had this moment where he's like, I'm in this place. I could do this. And then he kills this Egyptian. And then what happens the very next day? The Hebrews are like, we don't know. Like, who are you to us? And that terrifies him. And then out of faith he flees. That's what Hebrews says. And then it takes 40 years of extra training until he becomes that guy.
Then he was reluctant then.
Yeah. And I think in that sense there's a sign of someone who really understands what's entailed with leading a group of people. I think before he had no idea, and he's like, well, I'll just do it. Well, this isn't
He
something.
didn't have wisdom.
Yeah. Go ahead, Elaine.
Well, when they chose Esther to be one of the young women to go before the queen, she was taken from a group of women that nobody knew what their backgrounds were necessarily, that, you know, they could have been from anywhere in the nations that they were bringing in, but they were part of the royalty from the countries where they brought them in.
Yeah, so there's not a ton said about whether these women are from royal families or not. It's a pretty good guess that they probably had some kind of royal line, but all it says is...
the king wouldn't want some just...
Well, so this is the thing. When you look at it, I don't know if it matters all that much.
Well, it doesn't.
I think he just wanted someone that looked good.
Yeah.
I mean, I really think in my mind, when you look at and you paint the picture that they have painted, I think he could care less about the woman. As long as she looks good, it's all that matters. Because let's be honest, she's not going to have any influence on my kingdom, really. In his mind, he's probably thinking it doesn't matter. As long as she's pretty, as long as other people can look at her and be envious of me, I'm good with it. Which is really sad, but I think that might be the case. But I think, at least in my mind, as I read, as I put those other passages, if we are putting the best construction on it, they might have maybe not been so vocal about where they were from, but in my mind, I'm hoping or I'm thinking that you get this notion that like almost everybody who came in contact with Esther was pleased with Esther. And I think in that sense, maybe that's because of this notion that her good works were very visible. Here's a woman who loved to serve. And I think that is an attractive thing when people see that. They're like, oh, I like this.
Humble.
Yeah, humble. So I think in this sense, like, if I'm looking at it and I'm putting the best construction on it, I'm guessing whether it was sinful or not, I guess I can't specifically say. But what we can say is that the Lord is going to use this. And it's very clear that as time goes on, what actually takes place. There is I am this, and I'm here to really kind of try to save my people. So whether it doesn't start off that way, it obviously doesn't, but it gets to that point. So, and that, I'm at time. And the only thing that I didn't get to ask you is the conclusion, which you could talk about it on the drive home. If you're driving by yourself, talk to yourself. Yeah. As we live in a sinful world, that seems to ignore or rebel against God and His Word, what does this chapter, or how does this chapter give us hope? Right? I think 100% that's a good thing to think about. And as you look at this chapter, you can certainly come up with something. So, let's fold our hands. We'll say our prayer and I'll send you out. Here we go. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you. As we live in in a society that does seem in many places to rebel against you and to not care about your word. Move us to find great joy in the truth that you're always working for those people you love. You're always working for us. And even though like there might be sinful things that take place, you can bend them and you can work them for our good. We don't really know how that takes place, but you do. And you do those things for us. Move us to find great joy in your care. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.